Welcome to the Debate at Go8 podcast series. Today we're talking to Professor James Laurenceson, an economist, educator, analyst and researcher of all things China. He's director of the Australia-China Relations Institute, Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of the two countries. His research informs Australia's engagement with China. He's a regular media commentator on contemporary developments in China and the Australia-China relationship. He's previously held academic appointments at the University of Queensland, Shandong University in China, and Shimonoseki City University in Japan. Hello, my name's Ron Candelars. I'm a freelance journalist and producer, and throughout this series we've been canvassing a range of topics touching upon the work of all the Group of 8 universities. They include the Australian National University, Monash University, UNSW Sydney, Universities of Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Queensland and Western Australia. We've again taken to the road for this podcast. Also with me in our Sydney pod booth is the CEO of the Group of 8 universities, Vicky Thompson. Well, firstly, Professor James Laurenceson, I understand your academic interest in China goes way back. In fact, all the way back to an economics assignment in Brisbane in year 12. What was it all about and why the early fascination with China?
I think it was just because that China was so different to Australia, and that grabbed my attention and has held my attention ever since. I mean, it's pretty stunning that, I sort of settled on my career in grade 12, one grade 12 economics assignment, and I haven't moved away from it since. Probably the only difference is over the last 10 years, I've become more intensely focused on the Australia-China relationship rather than just the study of the Chinese economy. But I can't get away from China. That's where my interest and passion is.
So if we go back to that year 12 assignment, you came up with some basic information ideas. Can you remember much of what it was about? Or, I use this as a reference point to get us to understand how the Chinese economy has grown and the relationship with Australia has grown.
Yeah, so in that economics assignment, I do remember it was looking at China's economic growth during the Mao period, so during the period of central planning, of course. And then since then, a lot's changed. So but I think to understand the current context, you have to really appreciate that backstory as well. Otherwise, for example, you might say, well, the Chinese economy is not as marketized as the American economy or the Australian economy. But someone like me would say, well, boy, compared with the end of the 1970s, it has come a long, long way. And I can tell you that's exactly how the Chinese government and most Chinese people think about it. So some of these criticisms that get thrown at China, oh, you're not as marketized as us, well, they would say, well, hang on, in a pretty short space of time, we've come an awful long way in that direction.
And your institute looks at all of this. What's its main role? Is it there to inform and influence Australian government policy?
Inform, not influence. Right. So our mission is literally to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis and dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. So we're a liberal democracy. We've got a lot of diverse, vibrant voices. High passions about China on both sides of the spectrum. Great, bring it on. But sometimes I do think that what gets missed is some basic facts, and also, or sometimes very few people straight out lie about China. But what often happens is that a fairly narrow selection of facts gets presented. Other facts will simply not be talked about, and none of them are presented in context, whether that be a historical Chinese context or whether it is a context of putting China relative to other countries that we consider to be friends and partners.
So, James, do you think that has changed markedly over the last decade? Is it heightened at the moment?
Yeah, certainly has. I mean,
and why do you think that?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And I mean, let's just be clear that the main reason why it has become more heightened is because China's behaviour has changed, right? So I don't deny that at all. I think it's entirely legitimate that the Australian government is concerned about China's actions in the South China Sea or foreign interference in Australian universities. No complaints at all. But still, when we talk about those actions, particularly when it comes to foreign interference in Australian universities, some of the claims that get made are simply not based on facts and evidence. Right. And I think it's really important that we take that on, not because we're argumentative, but because if you don't rebut it, then those sorts of claims and allegations can get ahead of steam. Yeah. And the next thing that can happen is that it can start influencing Australian government policy.
Which it does,
Which it does, right.
And really hamstrings us. And the risk of all of that is that, and in fact we've had Senator James Patterson in our pod booth just recently, and I asked this direct question, do you want us not to do research with China? And of course the answer is no, because we know that research with China is incredibly important. So I think there is a risk to the conversation. It's either, we lean in or we don't. And it should not be that black and white, because they are a huge partner, both economically, but in research we've been working with China for decades in many, many domains, as you well know.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in there, Vicky, one other comment I would make is that if you listen to our intelligence agencies, right, Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, and you listen to what he says about this stuff around foreign interference in universities. For example, he says that universities are just one sector that's vulnerable to foreign interference. But sometimes this, single-minded lens gets put on universities. He also says that the response of universities, he's very pleased with it. He's very satisfied with it. So universities are working closely with the government. We're coming up with best practice plans. Mike Burgess also says that Australia is actually ahead of the curve in dealing with this sort of stuff. So I'm not really worried about our serious assessments agencies like ASIO. What I get more concerned about is some very noisy think tanks and individual commentators, including some members of parliament, that seem quite comfortable straying from those serious assessments and just throwing allegations at not just universities, but individual academics. I've come across a couple of those. I know people who've left the country, right, because they just feel that they can't operate in this environment anymore. And you can't tell me that's a win for Australia's national interest. No. That's a disaster.
And you have some figures that show the cooperation between in Australian universities and Chinese students. Can you just illustrate some of those points?
Yeah, sure. I've just in preparing for this, I was looking at the Web of Science database. Most academics would be familiar with that. It's just a big database of all global scientific and research publications. If you look at the total number of Australian articles produced, that is articles with at least one researcher affiliated with an Australian institution, more of those articles include a Chinese co-author than an American one, and it gets even more interesting when we drill down into specific disciplines. For example, when it comes to artificial intelligence, talk of the town, we're all interested in that. Well, if you look at the most highly cited Australian publications in artificial intelligence over the last 4 years, I can tell you there's 195 of them, and 133 of those, so 68%, include a Chinese co-author, right? 43 of them, just 22%, include an American co-author. So look, we're concerned about artificial intelligence and where China's headed on that. We want to work more with our American partners, great, but let's not imagine that we can diversify away, let alone cut off, the international partner that right now is our most important partner.
And that diversification issue is writ large, both in research but also in student numbers in our universities. And of course, the universities that I represent, the Group of 8, has a significant proportion of international students and a significant cohort of Chinese students. And you know as well as I do, James, that, and we've discussed this so many times, Ron, that cross-subsidisation of international students to actually fund our research effort. So for the Group of 8, I think we invest around $7.7 billion annually on research. We get around $2.8 billion from the federal government. Largely, the rest is made up from international students. So, and largely for us, it is Chinese students. So the challenge that is always put back to us is you must diversify. But of course, that one is not easy, and two, it's pretty important, I think, and I think our universities do, that we continue to engage with one of our largest trading partners. It's really important. So I'd be interested in your views on that diversification strategy, not just around research, because I think the figures are fairly clear there, but also around student cohorts. At a time, just to add, when I think the federal government is seriously looking at potentially going down the Canadian route and putting caps on numbers.
So the diversification argument, it's a good one to talk about. Look, one of the things I worry about this argument is not just that people have simplistic views, we can just get more Indian students and less Chinese students, which we all know is simply not true. I also worry that people draw this simplistic link between exposure and risk, right? So, let me talk about exports, not Chinese students at the moment. So a lot of people will say, well, look, 35% of Australia's exports go to China. My goodness, that's a disaster in waiting, right? Because if Beijing wanted to close its market, then we're in real trouble. Well, we've actually had a case study of this in action over the last few years. In 2020, Beijing did actually hit a dozen of our exports. Coal, cotton, copper, wine, you would know the list. What was the impact on the Australian economy? Basically zero, right? So we had a very large exposure, but the impact on the Australian economy was zero. Why was that? Well, a couple of very, very simple factors. One, Beijing didn't hit a lot of the big ticket items in the trade relationship because they need Australia just as much as we need Chinese iron ore, lithium, LNG. Okay. Most of the other goods that China did hit, for example, barley, coal. Beijing says, we don't want your barley and coal anymore. Australian producers basically shrug their shoulders. Why? Because they sell into competitive global markets. So they've just sold the global overnight, bang, low cost global markets. They didn't even have to diversify, right? They didn't have to go on a PR campaign. Global markets just reshuffled the trade. So Australian coal and barley went elsewhere. So in the end, there was actually only probably two sectors, wine and lobster, that actually did experience some pain. So I don't mean to minimise their pain, but you get my point, right? Yeah. People were just saying, look, we had this big exposure. That means we have a big risk. No. I mean, that's grade 1 level analysis. And so I think there's some not the same, but there are some parallels when it comes to Chinese students as well. Did Beijing turn off the tap of Chinese students over the last few years? No, in fact, during the pandemic, exactly, and that is my point, right? Yeah. During the pandemic, they were actually one of our most resilient.
And
markets.
You mentioned the number of co-authored publications, 190 or whatever. Obviously, there are, in terms of something as significant as AI, there are enormous benefits to Australian researchers because they're part of this process. So the big thing is not throwing out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to this issue of international students and research more generally.
Yeah, look, let me give you a couple stats. China now spends $600 billion on R&D every year, right? Australia spends about $20 billion. US spends around $700 billion. So if we want to stay at that knowledge creation frontier, we cannot do this by ourselves. We have to remain connected to the big players. Now, does that mean we shouldn't put in place risk mitigations when we're dealing with China? Of course we should put in place risk mitigations. But our intent should be to remain as connected as we possibly can, because China's producing a whole lot more intellectual property than Australia is now. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Sometimes you get this impression from some people that China's going to steal all our wonderful intellectual property.
We've got to have it to steal first.
We've got to have it to steal. And frankly,
and they've got a lot of it.
That's right.
They've got a lot more that we could access.
There might be a legitimate discussion in Beijing to say, well, do we really want to partner with Australia? Because these blokes might steal our IP.
Yeah. So I'm just interested, why are Chinese students so keen to come to Australia and more specifically Go8 universities?
Well, I think Vicky Thompson would be best placed to answer that one.
Well, I do know that our Chinese enrolments are up significantly from 2019 levels. So
that's despite whatever all the things that happened with COVID. And
I mean, that's not across the board, but for our universities. See, what happened over COVID, Ron, is what James alluded to, is the Chinese government actually relaxed the regulations around students being able to learn online. And that was a pretty big concession from them. And they did that for quite some time. So our students... So from the Chinese government side, they leaned in to support their students who are studying in Australia. And then from our side, and all universities did do this with their international students, but I certainly know we did, we also were very, very supportive of our students to help them go along. I think we have been surprised by the rapid sort of back to business as usual and then increase. And, some of my universities will say to me, and I don't know if this is true, James, you're probably better placed than I am with others, and particularly UTS, a big international university as well, that it has recovered as strongly as it has. So I'm not sure I am best placed to answer it, because I think there's a little bit of quality, obviously, all the things that we know, but they were all there before 2019. Now we're actually seeing increased numbers, whether that's just pent-up demand, and we've got some things happening in Canada The UK, they're putting caps on. So we're looking attractive, which is why we're concerned about what may be in the wind with caps here. And really, international students do tend to want to come to Sydney and Melbourne. So it's not the same picture, say, in Western Australia or in Adelaide. So it's a bit patchy depending on how you look at it.
Sorry, just very quickly. One other thing I'd say, people imagine that geopolitics always spills over to these sorts of interactions, but it's not the Chinese government that wakes up and decides how many Chinese students go to Australia every year, right? It's Chinese households, mums and dads talking with their kids. And, so sometimes Chinese state media will say some things that could well be interpreted in Australia as, Beijing might be making interactions with Australian universities more difficult. But Chinese households don't wake up every morning and start reading the People's Daily, right, or the Global Times. They talk to their friends, their family, and that's a great thing because we've had such a long history of Chinese student engagement. Most Chinese households literally know someone in their family or one of their close friends who have studied in Australia before, so they go to them for advice, not Beijing.
Yeah. And how important is that for the issue of soft diplomacy more generally, the number of students who've come to this country over such a long period of time?
I've had Australian diplomats tell me that it doesn't get any better. Right? These people are our
best ambassadors.
Our best ambassadors. It's pretty hard to argue with that. I think that's exactly right.
But there is a concern in the community, given what happened with trade embargoes, given the amount of media attention that's been given to foreign interference in Australian universities. How do we deal with that issue, and how do we make sure that our research is protected?
I think the number one thing I'd say about foreign interference in Australian universities is you just can't lump it all together as one single thing, foreign interference, right? So, for example, if we're talking research collaboration, then we've got concerns around the ethical implications of it. We've got maybe intellectual property involved, although typically not. Let's be clear on that, but there could be. Or are we concerned about the silencing of dissent in classrooms? Yeah. So these are very, very different issues, right? So the tools and the processes that you bring to manage them are going to be very, very different. Now, when it comes to the research collaboration space, I think the evidence is overwhelming there from authoritative sources like ASIO, like the Department of Home Affairs, that Australian universities are actually doing a fantastic job. I mean, I think of some of the allegations that were thrown around a couple years ago. I remember this big front page on the Australian newspaper. I think it said China's science swindle, how the CCP is stealing our best and brightest. You should have seen the allegations thrown around like that. Mike Burgess, the director of ASIO, basically just rebutted each of those points one by one. The Australian Research Council did its own investigation. They came back and found zero intellectual property theft. Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO, said there was no cases he was aware of that Australian universities had not lived up to regulatory controls like defence trade controls. So the things that are being said versus the facts and evidence from the authoritative sources are just wildly different.
So where does the University Foreign Interference Task Force, UFIT, fit into all this? Because the Go8 was a founding member. How do you rate its effectiveness on these sorts of issues?
Oh, well, look, I should just declare a conflict of interest here. I was actually one of the original university sector representatives in the 2019 edition. So I'll get that on the table first. We all want to be transparent. I think it's been fantastic. And Ron, it's not really what I think. It's what does Mike Burgess think, right? What does the Education Minister think? What does the Secretary of Home Affairs think? They all think it's been fantastic. I remember some comments that came out in Senate estimates where you had a very senior Home Affairs official, and he was asked about university participation and engagement in this process, and he said, universities have been great. But then he also said something very telling. He said, and you know what? At Home Affairs, we've learned a few things too.
Absolutely.
Because the idea that a bureaucrat knows intimately how universities operate, I mean, it's just a joke, right? So it was nice to see some self-awareness.
I've been around for 20 years in universities and I still don't know how they operate. But you raise a really interesting point about, it helped open the dialogue and it was an educative process for all parties involved. Just want to switch gears a bit. So in the last, we're awaiting, and potentially by the time this goes to air, we'll have an announcement that Japan is joining Pillar 2 of the AUKUS agreement. And you and I were privileged to be at a recent meeting when the Foreign Minister came, and there's no doubt that, the advent of AUKUS has created some challenges in perception and reality. What do you think will be the reaction, and we've seen a little bit of it, from China to Japan joining that Pillar 3, which really is the research domains, which is what we're interested in? And you've just quoted remarkable statistics in the artificial intelligence space, for example. Cybersecurity, hypersonics, all of those areas sit under AUKUS Pillar 2. Where do you think that will leave our research collaboration?
Yeah, I don't. When I look at Beijing's reaction to the announcement that Japan might be more involved in AUKUS, I don't see anything to be particularly alarmed by, to be frank. I mean, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has come out and said a few strident, angry remarks like they often do. I mean, honestly, that's really nothing to be panicking about. I think what we're seeing in the Australia-China relationship at the moment, after 3 years of complete dysfunction from sort of 2020 to the start of 2022, you've actually got both sides once again recognising the differences. No one's pretending they're not there, but also agreeing to manage those differences constructively, recognising that there's a whole lot of positive areas of mutual benefit to be gained as well. I mean, when I was in that meeting with Wang Yi a couple weeks ago, when I listened to him speak, I was struck by a lot of his rhetoric actually sounded quite similar to Penny Wong's rhetoric, right? We recognise differences, we rise above them, manage them constructively, and we're going to get on with the job of mutual cooperation. So AUKUS has been in train for a couple of years now. Beijing re-engaged with Australia in May 2022 with the election of the Albanese government. They're not imagining AUKUS is going to go away. Of course, they're not happy about it, and they'll continue with some hairy-chested remarks, but that's baked into their assessment, and I don't see that being a particular drama for our research cooperation with China.
So just on the research cooperation, though, I mean, I hear what you say about the cooperation of different published articles, etc. But what has China shared with the rest of the world in terms of research breakthroughs? And here in Australia, what would you point to as those research breakthroughs that point to its bona fides as a legitimate and trustworthy collaborator on major research projects?
Well, let me rather than just talk about Australia, let me talk about it at a global level. Okay, and that's probably even the more important level. So if you look at the Web of Science database now, you'll find that over the last 4 years, China has now, I've got to get my decimal points here, has produced 2.6 million scientific articles compared with the United States, which has produced 1.9 million, right? So they are now producing more scientific articles than any other country in the world. If you look at highly cited publications, so these, a measure of quality, the highest impact, the best scientific publications over the last 4 years, China's produced 31,000. The United States has produced 21,000, right? So China is at the global knowledge creation frontier. We've got to that's reality, right? Yeah. Now, how that filters through to collaboration with Australian universities, I think what you're seeing is China's getting to that global frontier across a widening area of disciplines now. So I think that impact is not only getting larger, but it's also getting more diverse, and we certainly don't want to walk away from that.
The big one that comes to mind is Gardasil vaccine. Yeah. I mean, that was Ian Fraser and his partner, who's sadly passed away before he actually saw the benefits of his research, and we've spoken to Ian Fraser, but that was a joint partnership between Chinese researchers and Australian researchers, saving hundreds of thousands of lives. And there's a lot of research that we also do in the health space. I mean, we seem to be very focused around defence. Yeah. Well, I can tell you that we have big tall fences around small paddocks, and so does China. And, I think the thread of this conversation is be alert and protect that which must be protected, but don't be alarmed and be sort of reasonable about what it is that we're doing. I just want to take you back to something you said about, people going out in front pages of The Australian and particular politicians, and it's very political, isn't it? It really is playing into some political narrative which seems to ebb and flow, I think. So right now we're sitting here at University of Sydney. There's a lot of talk about the housing crisis, rental prices, and
caps
a lot
on
of that
students.
Caps on students, because that will solve the problem. How much of it, unfortunately, is about politics as opposed to good policy and playing to a political narrative, which I think is as damaging, frankly, as the reality of where we are at.
Well, I'll give you my personal view, and listeners are free to disagree. But I agree with Penny Wong, right, when she says that during the last 18 months of the former Morrison government's term, a lot of their rhetoric towards China was really driven by domestic politics. Which I don't think is helpful to anyone. But the good news, if I can say that, is that I think at the last federal election, that politics of division, when it came to China, was pretty resoundingly rejected. We know there was a number of federal seats that flipped from the coalition to Labor or independents, and they had a high proportion of Chinese Australians. So they certainly made their voices felt. And we know that in the coalition's own wash-up, own assessments of their performance, they were also told that they really need to be more cautious and professional when it comes to their rhetoric around China. And I think for the most part where we are seeing a bit more discipline being taken.
So you're at the cutting edge, you're working with a lot of these Chinese students. What would you be saying to government then in this time where there is talk of caps on the number of students coming into Australia?
Well, I'd say listen to the scientists, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones who know where the talent they need are located, right? The idea, Ron, that a bureaucrat sitting in Canberra or some security analyst sitting at a think tank in Canberra knows how Australian scientists can best conduct their research and move Australia's national interests forward. Oh my goodness! It's naive. It's plainly ridiculous. So I think we need to trust the scientists, and I'm pretty sure those scientists will tell you that look, going forward, we need to maintain strong pipelines of students from China at the undergraduate level, but perhaps even more so when it comes to those postgraduate level, because we're not going to get them domestically. No. We're not going to get them from America. China's got to be one of the major contributors.
So if you were to revisit your Year 12 assignment, which sparked all of this interest in 2024, I won't shame you by saying how many years hence that might be, but a couple of decades maybe, does it still hold?
Yeah, it does. Look, I mean, I'm an economist, so I tend to gravitate to trade numbers, and research collaboration numbers are important because that's part of technological progress as well. But last year, despite all the geopolitical tensions, and they're real, I'm not pretending they didn't exist, but Australia's exports, two-way trade, and trade surplus with China all hit record highs, right? We've never sold a more diverse bunch of goods and services. People think it's just about iron ore. Yeah, iron ore is the big ticket item, but there's been a massive lithium trade that's developed, LNG. China's our largest market, not just for minerals. It's our largest market for fuels. It's our largest market for agriculture. It's our largest market for tourism. It's our largest market for education as well. So across the board, minerals, fuels, agriculture and services, China's number one.
So it's come a long way since your Year 12 assignment. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming in for today's podcast.
Pleasure, folks. Thanks for the chat.
Beauty. Thanks for your company today. If you'd like more information about the issues raised in this podcast or other related topics, please visit our website at go8.edu.au. And a quick reminder that you can always tune into Debate at Go8 on Spotify, Google, Apple or YouTube. Bye for now.